So greetings, hello, it's Dr. Thomas Daffern here. My weekly fasting talk. Today is the last day of August, August the 29th actually, 2021. It's been, pretty amazing month. We've seen lots of stuff going on in the world, particularly I want to talk about Afghanistan, 20-year war cycle. I'll come to that later. I want to just say that I'm speaking again from the room of Clio, the Muse Clio, who is education and history. Last week I spoke about historical research. I'm a historian among many other things, and I shared something of my passion for history. Today I want to share another of my passions, which is for education, because obviously I'm an educator, a teacher. I've taught at universities and in schools, and I believe, like John Keats said, this whole world is a school for souls. I think Emerson picked up on that idea as well. Life is for learning. Life is about education, and that includes both formal education that we do in schools, colleges, universities. It also includes informal education that we learn with our families, our friends, and from events. So Clio, as the Muse of Education, there's an awful lot of books in this room, in this study, as I call it, about the history of education, about what is education? And, many great thinkers have thought about this for centuries. Every culture in world history has developed a certain educational philosophy. And, I come from Canada and Britain. We have a general kind of accepted basic understanding of the importance of education. This was drilled into me by my parents, particularly my mother, my father sadly died when I was 17, and he had Alzheimer's, so he sort of lost the plot a bit. But my mother was as bright as a button till the age of 98, and she was an educator herself. She was of a generation of women that went to university before World War II. In the 1930s, she went to the University of London and did a French degree, Latin as well, and Anglo-Saxon. In those days, languages were quite, an intensive study. And then she eventually got involved in teacher education and teacher training. She worked as a school teacher at Western Grammar School in Brighton, and then in the University of Sussex, where she was a vice person, a teacher of teachers, developing courses on European studies. And of course, fortunately, she died before Brexit. She would have had a nightmare if she'd have been around when Brexit happened. I'm sure she would have been an all-out campaigner against it, as I am. So I honour her as an educator. She knew how important a continental-wide view of knowledge, scholarship, philosophy is. Because she had her French degree, she came here to France in the 1930s. We have old photographs of her coming to Paris. She loved travel, she loved internationalism, and for her, the racism and stupidity of Nazism, its anti-cosmopolitanism and its anti-intellectualism, was why she fought during World War II on the home front to try and protect Britain from this scourge of Nazism. And it led her to join active groups against the Nazis during World War II, like anyone of any common sense in Britain did. So she would be horrified at the way that Britain has now become a kind of poodle of right-wing bigotry and petty racism and petty Nazism, dressed up by people like Farage and Boris Johnson, these little Gauleiters, I call them, of the Conservative Party, which has become an instrument of this right-wing nonsense. Eileen would have seen through all that. So I'm her son, I'm still on duty, she's gone. I'm here reminding people, get active and save Europe from these complete idiots, and get Britain back in the hands of a decent, humane, left-leaning, intelligent alliance of all the progressive anti-conservative parties. The role of the media in this, of course, is criminal. The fact that these things are not happening is simply down to the BBC and the mainstream media, the Telegraph and the papers of the rich, the 1%, who pump out this vitriol against Europe and ultimately against anything that doesn't fit their own little narrow agenda. You know, the role of propaganda. A colleague of mine, Piers Robinson, has written a lot about propaganda. You know, is how these things are done. We all know from Chris Wiley how Brexit was won was with propaganda. Now, education is a totally different thing. As a teacher of education, a philosopher, my duty is to find out truth and then share that. And if I can't find the truth out, then I can share at least a method how to get to truth, as Descartes said. Descartes came from not far from where I'm recording this, in the middle of France, a little village town not far away. And although he's blamed for all the problems of the world by certain kinds of green intellectuals that say Descartes was the source of everything that's wrong with our worldview, I think that's a bit fair. I mean, unfair. He was a complex, intelligent man who, you know, thought deeply about existence and realised that if we apply geometric method to thought, it's going to be helpful. He was trying to reconcile mathematics and theology. He kept a faith in God. He kept a faith in spirituality. And he knew intuitively somehow it's got to do with the mystery of consciousness. I think, therefore I am. You know, the mystery of consciousness is still number one on the agenda of any intellectual that wants to try and find out the meaning of life. And consciousness studies is a great passion of mine, along with colleagues in the Galileo Commission, David Lorimer chairs, and many other great thinkers are looking at the nature of consciousness. We're doing empirical research. Does consciousness survive death? Well, it seems to, empirically, and if so, that's got huge implications. It means my consciousness is not limited to my body. It means when I die, that consciousness will live on. How? What's it made of? Where is it? You know, these are all questions that Descartes grappled with, and they're still very interesting. But he's an example of a philosophical educator, and he even got to be teaching monarchs. As you know, he went to teach Queen Christina in Sweden. Sadly, that killed him off because she used to make him get up really early and trot along to her palace. And he caught pneumonia in the snow. I mean, it's killing Descartes is a really naughty thing Christina did. She then apologised and converted to Catholicism and gave up her throne, which is like a good remorse. Well done, Christina. I'm sure they're very happily studying in the Heavenly Library. Why is education so important? Well, to me personally, I've always wanted to know. I think, you know, I don't agree with conventional psychologists, you know, that either the great thrust drive we have is for more and more sex. No, that's, you know, come on. And I don't agree with Adler that it's for power, because that's just banal. No, it's for knowledge. And this is why I've written my book, Being and Knowledge. I think human beings, Homo sapiens, we have this unique gift for knowledge. We can know things. Now, birds, much as I love them, they're limited in their knowing. They know how to fly, which I can't do. They know how to make beautiful sounds in the sunset and find their insects, and how to love, and to, you know, they're profoundly knowledgeable. And the same with all little animals. That is part of life. And as Sir Karl Popper said, I had an interview with him just before he died. He gave a brilliant lecture at the LSE about epistemology and evolution. And he said, knowledge is part of the evolutionary thrust of life. It's the organic will to know. And the little amoeba is limited in what it can know. So life is constantly inventing new complexity, like the nervous system, better eyes, you know, mouths that can speak and listen, ears that can listen. It's actually the will to knowledge that is behind the evolutionary thrust, said Popper, and I agree with him. Alfred Russel Wallace, one of my intellectual heroes, again, he was sort of saying the same thing. That's our duty, our destiny, is to know. So I'm just another human on the block who wants to know, and I wanted to know particularly why the world is so full of wonderful potential. We have amazing people growing up in Brighton, just incredible people, like my teachers, highly intellectual. I went to Brighton Hove Grammar School, Brighton Hove and Sussex Grammar School, and there were some good teachers. Before that I went to Brighton College and there were some good teachers. But there's also, I realise, a lot of like thugs in the world, people that aren't interested in knowledge, who shout you down, people that won't listen, people that actually are violent if you try and teach them something, or And I learned to cross the street on the other side from the kind of people that carried sticks around and were making racist comments. We called them skinheads in those days. And they exist in every culture. There's an anti-intellectual element in every civilization, which is a shame, but it's a fact. And so what can we do about this? Well, every teacher has had problems with this. In the days of Pythagoras, he tried to teach a very esoteric knowledge. He'd spent years gathering and garnering together. So he made, firstly, if you join my academy, you have to keep quiet for a year. That shows your dedication, your discipline, your devotion to wisdom, to knowledge. Because it's not the teacher that you're devoted to, it's the knowledge that they have that you can then acquire. That's why I'm bothering with these lectures. I'm not seeking any kind of outer fame or fortune or my name to be known. No, I just want you guys to awaken. That's why I bother week after week. Okay, so anyway, I was a lifelong student. I studied, I did my A-levels. I went to study philosophy at the University of Bristol. I found the teaching unacceptably poor because it was a very narrow curriculum. And it was the 70s, so I rebelled and I dropped out and I went and studied philosophy alone in Canada. I'd read Wittgenstein that he used to go off to a cabin in Norway and study independently. So I did the same in a cabin in Canada for 4 years. And that's where I really did my deep, deep study, those 4 years in the late 70s, early 80s. And then I came back to Britain and I did a second degree in history this time, as I explained, but including lots of philosophy, history of thought and so on. And then I was given a job after graduating, founding an Institute of Peace Studies at the University of London. I talked about this last week. At the Institute of Education, which is Britain's leading centre for educational scholarship and research. And that was a real wonderful job opportunity, and it was a privilege to work there, along with many colleagues. And I travelled, I spoke in conferences about education, and I studied how is peace taught, what is peace education, what is peace studies, how do educators at the moment respond to the challenge of the world post-war, World War II. Is there peace education in different countries? So I went to Moscow, I went to Paris, I went to San Francisco, I went to California and New York and Columbia University, and I interviewed educators from all over the world. And I still have those interviews on tape. I said, how would you educate for peace? And I pressed the record button. And I gradually got a realization that it's multi-dimensional and multidisciplinary. Peace studies is a multidisciplinary field, a very new field that's arisen, in which all the conventional disciplines like anthropology, economics, sociology, history, philosophy and so on, theology, and all the natural sciences, they all have a contribution to make to the development of peace studies. We can reframe what we do as historians or anthropologists or biologists and say, well, if I was asking myself, how does this knowledge best advance peace in the world? What kind of books would I write? What kind of research? I also came to Paris at that time and I interviewed people in France, in French intellectual life. I discovered there are little centres for peace research in Paris. And of course I went to UNESCO. I went to, obviously UNESCO, that's what it's paid to do. It is the UN agency tasked with education and with peace and with preventing wars. And I met people who were high up in the UNESCO. I went to conferences they were organising. I spoke in Cordoba at a conference of UNESCO experts on actually intercultural education, looking at Andalusia, Jewish, Christian and Muslim, medieval cultural achievements and whether we could bring back that golden age. I also spoke in the Philippines at a conference of university presidents of peace, and they were working with the UN Department of Disarmament Affairs. The rectors of universities all over the world are trying to see that universities can be used as bastions of peace development. Education is not a neutral thing. It's either you're being trained to become part of an oppressive system and to game the system so that your little elite can control the money, wealth, power, and military might of a given culture. Or education is a democratizing function of, pragmatic universalism, to use John Dewey's phrase, which is Columbia University Teachers College, where I interviewed people. Betty Reardon, one of the world's great peace educators, is there. I interviewed her, and also Morton Deutsch, who was a psychologist of peace education. So, and then I came back to London and I set up the Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. So, after going around the world, gathering these huge numbers of files, tangible knowledge artifacts, you could call them, I then published the feasibility study. Yes, the University of London should have something similar. We should have an Institute of Peace Studies, which would include elements to do with teacher training, education for peace, classroom, conflict resolution training, mediation in schools, that kind of thing. But also anthropology can play a role, sociology, economics, philosophy, and all the other disciplines. Now, they're scattered throughout the University of London. So I came up, I said, look, let's have a new Federal Institute for Peace Studies in the University of London system. And let's do some really, really high-level research. And let's make it available to the public so it becomes like the public conscience of Britain's peace thinkers. People can do degrees there, they can research how to prevent conflicts and so on. And I also said that it should be affiliated maybe to like a National Institute of Peace, that it should help create policy in the UK that would, instead of going to war all the time, it would have a statutory duty to advise governments, whatever their political hue, on preventing wars and resolving them if they tragically start. What I didn't realise at the time was one is up against the legacy of the British Empire and the imperialists who benefited from military-industrial enterprises, who like their high-tech equipment, which can drop multiple nuclear warheads on 50 cities at once, courtesy of Trident submarines, and who don't want peace to become central to British policymaking. And so, sadly, as yet, that Institute of Peace Studies hasn't happened. I'm very happy if it would. I'd like to bequeath that as part of my legacy to the British and the world community, because I still believe in London. It's a great experiment in multiculturalism, in diversity of religions. It has tremendous libraries. The University of London is the biggest English-speaking university in the world. It has diverse colleges and so on. I still think there should be an Institute of Peace Studies as part of that, and I will work my socks off to see it comes to pass. But I don't think it's ever going to come to pass as long as we ever have a Tory government in power. They simply don't seem to have peace in their soul, this lot. True Tories did. Harold Macmillan said, okay, winds of change, Africa, time for independence. He was an intelligent Tory. So was Winston Churchill. He wanted, after the war, he wanted a peaceful Europe. He didn't want to take huge retributions out on Germany. He wanted to reconstruct in a way that would guarantee peace perpetually in Europe. He'd be horrified at Brexit. And the fact that these arch-Nazis have used his thinking to somehow peddle their wares. I knew people that knew Churchill, and he was a man ultimately of peace. Anyway, that's how I got into directing the Institute and setting it up at the Institute of Education. So the whole thing is an educational project. That's why I bother giving talks, that's why I run conferences, and that's why I'm wedded to the goal of preventing World War III. We need nuclear disarmament. We need to divest the money that goes into weapons of war towards peaceful use. And the most important thing we can do with that money is education. I've taught in schools which are very poor, which have drips coming from the roof. No, our schools should be given more money than the military. It should be a bigger element of the budget in every country worldwide. That's why I dreamed up the idea of education aid. I just want to talk about that briefly. When I was at the Institute of Education, I noticed Bob Geldof got an honorary degree from my university. And I was surprised. I didn't know. But once in the University of London calendar, which was like our Bible. So there's a photograph on the front page. Who are the Princess Anne, who's the Vice Chancellor of the university, and then the officials who kind of run the thing, chairman of convocation, chairman of the court, and so on. And then in one of these photographs, it's not this one, suddenly you saw Bob Geldof on the back row with his long hair looking like a rock star. And I noted, he'd got an honorary degree. And I thought, how cool is that? Because he organised this thing, if you recall, Live Aid, which raised billions for famine relief around the world. I remember that well. We all rocked along to that. And it sort of downloaded to me that why don't we do the same with education? If Bob Geldof could get the great pop stars of the world together to make a huge concert, which then with our multimedia is beamed out all over the world to television stations, and if people can donate online and we can raise millions, what would it be like if every school and university in the world had a day off work once a year, March the 1st, St. David's Day. That's my chosen day. And instead, you go to school, you go to university as normal, but you don't have normal lectures or normal classes. Instead, you do fundraising events. So, in your local primary school, in wherever, in Stenning or somewhere in Sussex. So the local primary school kids would put on a little play. They would have a jumble sale. They would have, a little mock beauty pageant or a contest. They'd have debating contests whereby, these 5 kids would debate those 5 kids. Should there be capital punishment or whatever? Now, all of these would be sponsored, so they'd be badgering their parents and their friends in the 2 weeks up to it, saying, sponsor me, 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes you'll give 10p to this or whatever. And then in the evening there'd be like the parents and the bigwigs that run the school would come and have a posh dinner, and again, tickets are 50 quid. And then the speeches, and the Lord Mayor gives a little talk. Now, so each little primary school around the UK and France and Europe and America and all over the world, Russia, could raise, I don't know, let's say 3,000 quid for each little primary school. I mean, it might be more, because some of these schools, like in Kensington or Paris, they might have very wealthy kids going, and then the parents, it'd be kudos to give extra money. Some of the events will be filmed, and they'd be shown on television channels. Like the primary school of Orsay is doing a fantastic thing. They've set up a climbing frame in the sports hall, and they're all climbing for education aid. Okay. Secondary schools will be doing the same thing. They have no classes. They would be doing maybe more adventurous things, like going on an outward bound type exploration, climbing a mountain, raising money by, if we get up to the top of the mountain, we raise 20 quid or something. Or they might be having races and having a sports day. They might put on a play for which tickets are a little more expensive than usual that evening. They might do a concert. The school band could do a concert. They might have poetry contests in which the poets of the school would compete for the Delphic Laureate Award of the year. They might have music competitions in which the pianists are all doing music at A level. They'd play the same Beethoven sonata, and then the audience would judge who won. Well, it would all be sponsored. So a secondary school could raise, I don't know, let's say 5,000, 10,000 quid, because there'd be the posh dinner in the evening, and parents, like at my old Brighton Home Sussex Grammar School, it would be a big thing. There's 500 kids, all with a devotion to education. Okay, and then universities would do the same. So not just schools would have the day off, but all universities worldwide. Can you imagine this now? You've got the Sorbonne, you've got the University of Oxford, you've got London University, all its colleges, Imperial College, LSE. You've got Columbia University, which I know and love. You've got Harvard, which likewise I've spent time studying in. You've got Berkeley, University of California, the whole American university system, the whole British, the whole European, and the Russian, and the Chinese, because this is a global event, education aid. it would be approved by UNESCO, and every education minister would have signed a thing saying, we love this idea, we're going to do it. So they'd say they've all agreed, no school that day, but just fundraising stuff. And I reckoned, I mean, if you work it out, I've done some sums, I've looked at this. Given the number of universities in the world, the number of schools, colleges, seminaries, secondary and primary schools, you know, you could raise like several £billion every year for education aid. Now, a third of that money would be kept by the institution raising it. So let's say Harvard University raises $100,000. I mean, at least it would get that, because even the posh dinner in the evening would be like, you know, $1,000 a head, because Harvard produces lots of very important, influential people. And they'd all love to go back, Harvard Business School, Law School, etc. Obama, and they'd have probably like 10 previous presidents who would give after-dinner speeches. And then, so every university, every school, every college would have raised this money in aggregate. A third of each institution's total would be kept by that institution. So my local primary school in Stenning or Hove would keep it there in-house, and that would be really useful. It could go to help the library get restocked. It would help to hire a nutritionist who could give advice on improving the diet of the kids, or whatever. It could put a new roof on in some schools. A third of the money raised would go to a national fund, so it would go to be distributed throughout the country concerned. And then a third would go into a global pot, and it would then be distributed anywhere in the world to countries that most need it. I mean, I was friends with a Roman Catholic Archbishop Angelo Fernandez, who was a great man. He was the head of all Catholic schools worldwide. I had the honour to meet him, and we shared some long conversations. And he told me, Thomas, you know, I have to say, as head of the Catholic schools worldwide, and there are quite a lot of them, you know, tens of thousands, they would all be part of this education aid project, by the way. It was round about then that I thought the thing up. He said, yes, it's a great idea, but, you know, in Africa, some of our kids, they walk to school 20 kilometres on an empty stomach. There's no food at home. And so the first thing we do when they get to school is give them breakfast. So, and only then are they going to be ready to learn about the Bible or philosophy or Christianity or maths or geography or anything. So schools, sometimes they're the lifeline for kids in war-torn countries, kids in refugee camps, places where there's real poverty and desperation, like in Haiti, say now, with the earthquake, or in Greece and Turkey, where there's huge forest fires been happening. I mean, education is the lifeline between planetary catastrophe and planetary salvation. And so education aid could be a huge positive thing, and that's why I still believe in this project, and I dreamed it up at the Institute of Education, thanks to the Bob Geldof photo. And, you know, Princess Anne is our Chancellor, and I hope that, well, I would really sincerely love to get that thing really up and running. You know, maybe its headquarters should be in Paris at UNESCO. Please contact me if you realise the importance of that project. That would, I think, send a message to the powers that be that, you know, the pen really is mightier than the sword, and that the ink of the scholar is worth more than the blood of the martyr, because at the moment the blood of the martyrs is privileged. Look at these poor people in Afghanistan being blown up by people that mistakenly think that doing that is going to be good in the eyes of Allah. It's going to get you into heaven. I mean, that's what we're up against, this ignorance. And we have to, through the work of scholars, through the work of educators, through the work of frontline teachers, we have to change that thought meme that says that violence is the way to advance progress in society. No, it's not. Gandhi was absolutely right. Gandhi was a great educator. Non-violence is the way to go. Non-violence was always absolutely the sine qua non for any higher yogic or Indian philosophical studies. You can't study under a guru of any kind, any quality, unless you swear an oath of non-violence, ahimsa, which means thought, word, and deed. There's no ifs and buts, you know. And Gandhi, that's why he said, look, if India's going to be independent from these British, it wasn't that he was anti-British. He had many British friends and American and Western friends. But he was anti the system of violence that they believed in. And I take the same view. I'm British myself, but I've outgrown the violent imperialism and the colonialism and the gung-ho, let's bomb the country and claim the rewards type attitude. Okay, so during my research, when I was setting up the Institute in the early days, I began began teaching. Both at the Institute, we taught part of the PGCE training course for teachers on how to be a teacher in a conflict-ridden world. It has implications for the curriculum in schools, but it also has implications for classroom management, how you deal with disruptive, angry kids in schools. Are schools violent places? What's going on? Why is there so much bullying? And how can education become violent-free? How can we have non-violent schools in a non-violent world? So we looked at all that, me and a bunch of other colleagues, David Maxwell, Tony Weaver, Jagdish Gandhar, and other senior educators at the Institute. Then I was looking at comparative education. So because I was traveling around, I went to Russia, America, the Middle East, all over Europe. And so I was asking, well, what is education for you? And it's got a really interesting history. And so I compiled a dictionary of philosophical terminology in all different languages. And one of the key words in that dictionary is education. Education in Latin means a bringing out, a drawing out, which ultimately means of the soul, from its entanglement in desire, greed, power, lust, all that stuff. No, education is the realization of the soul, by the soul, of its true spiritual freedom. It's a sort of Orphic tradition, and it goes right back to the mystery schools of the ancient world, Eleusis and Samothrace and the other great mystery schools, where Orpheus also was part of, and Pythagoras. True education is initiation into the mysteries, and my colleague, who is professor of the philosophy of education at the University of London, F.E. Peters, argued this in detail. Look, education is initiation. So I was very interested in all that and thought that, well, let's do it. Let's get on with it. Let's get global education for peace. And what's not to like here, and that's still my passion, still my life's work. So I then trained as a school teacher because I wanted to go, as I'd done elite sort of university level stuff. I'd written most of my PhD by then. I'd interviewed professors from all over the world. In Sweden, particularly where they take education for peace very seriously. I'd gone to Stockholm Peace Research Institute. I'd interviewed experts in Norway at the Oslo Centre for Peace and the human rights. And I realised in Scandinavia they're way ahead of the British in terms of privileging the importance of peace over war. They gave up war. It's an addiction. The Swedes, the Norwegians, the Danes, they haven't done a major war for a very long time. It's just a bit passé. It's very childish. The English and the people that run the Westminster, as it's called by my Scottish friends, haven't given up that addiction. Nor have the people in Washington that run Washington, and they're still addicted to this. Every problem has a military solution kind of ideology, and it is so passé and so wrong. It doesn't. Most of the problems of the world do not have a military solution. Militarism should only ever be used in self-defense against some force or army that's gone completely berserk. It should be there, but only as a minimum self-defense. Like the Swedish army. You don't see this. I don't think the Swedes are going to invade